Okay, awesome. All right. Well, yes, welcome everybody to the February Our Revolution Howard County meeting. It is, of course, Black History Month, and we tried to pick a topic that fits within that theme as we've done for the last few Februaries for the last few years. And so thank you to our guest speaker, Lawrence Grand Prix, who we're going to hear from in a little bit. Continuing on here, just to go over the agenda of what to expect for tonight. We're going to go over the ground rules, maybe do a little bit of time for short introductions for people if it's their first meeting, updates from the steering committee, treasurer's report, some updates from different committees and work groups that we've got going, like Stop WR Grace Group, Palestinian Solidarity, and other committees that we've got in the works. Plugging our social media and other ways to follow along with what the chapter's doing between meetings. Stay plugged in. Just some updates on what we've been up to between meetings. And then get to the main course of the evening, which of course is Lawrence's presentation on Jim Rouse. That's what to expect for tonight. Of course, ground rules. Mostly for the people on Zoom, if you're not talking, please just stay on mute so it doesn't pick up background noise. If you want to say something, either during the general meeting or, during the Q&A part afterwards, you can use the hand raise feature on Zoom, or in real life, you can just raise your hand in real life. And just for people, know, we do have masks over there in case people, would like to mask up. When we do get to the Q&A portion, towards the end of the meeting, we do ask that you keep your questions to 1 minute or less, just so everybody has time to say their piece. And of course, be respectful. So those are the ground rules. We can go around and do just some introductions real quick for some of the new folks, some of the people that I don't recognize, I guess we'll say. So you sir. Yeah, you don't have to introduce. Yeah, people don't have to introduce themselves if you prefer not to. You're saying, okay, cool. Well, I know you guys. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Good city resident. I've been part of the for a long time, but I've been trying to answer so much. Concerned citizen.
Yes, thank you for being here. It's good to see you again, Gus. Iman, I'll skip ahead to our steering committee introduction. We do have a new steering committee member, Iman, and so if you want to introduce yourself, Iman, and what your interests are and what you've been, helping the chapter with.
I'm a member of the steering committee. I'm the social media manager of Our Revolution Howard County. Past year, I've been vocally, very loudly expressing my solidarity with not only the Palestinians, but with the Lebanese people, Syrians, Yemeni, and Sudanese people who are currently going through a genocide and ethnic cleansing. And the warmongers are still on the loose. So here I am.
Thank you. Ying, we know you as our vice chair again. We're only going to do new people that we haven't heard. Would you like to introduce yourself, sir? Mm-hmm. Yes, awesome. Were you the guy, Matt Bowen? Okay, well, nice to meet you in person here, Matt. Next we could go to, Robertson Nod. Okay, yeah.
Hi everyone. I live in Elkridge, and I found out about Our Revolution through what used to be Sunrise Health. I'm mainly concerned by the presence of ice everywhere.
Yes. Yeah, no, thank you. And it's nice to meet you in person, Lexi. And yeah, I think that is a big topic on a lot of people's minds is, the ramping up of ICE raids and whatnot under the Trump administration. I think we may do something around that at our April meeting, if not, events outside of the monthly meetings before then.
the Immigrant Justice Coalition has restarted and will be creating events.
Yeah, the Howard County Coalition for Immigrant Justice, which played a big role in pressuring our county executive to end our county's contract with ICE in 2020, is in the beginning stages of reviving. And Our Revolution Howard County was a big part of that coalition back in 2020, and hopefully we can be a big part of that. Like, it would have been nice if the coalition, remained active even under Biden, but here we are. And so, yeah, thank you for that. But yeah, nice to see you, Lexi.
A revolution 40 years ago, I had a unit here from the opposite, and the mayor was
Thank you. I have definitely seen your name over the years, and awesome. Awesome. Well, thank you both for being here. Yes. No. I did see. I assume you're Katie Serene. You said what? Oh, no. I did see it. I assume you're Katie S. And so yeah, I did see you, and definitely want to reach out to you sooner rather than later about some exciting stuff happening in Columbia, which we are going to talk about a little bit more in the meeting. But last and not least, you're starting well. Oh, good to see you, Jim. It's been a while, but yeah, good to see you. Good to see you. Yes. Okay. So that is it. I'm sorry for the people virtually that may have been tough to listen to. Just for the sake of time, and I don't know how easy it'll be when you all speak to hear you. So I think we are just gonna move along with the rest of the meeting. I'm sorry for those on virtually not being able to do introductions, but we do appreciate you being on here in general. And so we can move along. So yes, steering committee, gangs, for the most part, all here. Thank you for introducing yourself. Imani's been doing a great job, running helping to run our social media. And so thank you for that. And then, just, treasurer's report. I don't know about any, no changes in funds from last month. No. We are, I know we keep saying this, but we are about to open up, we have a lot of money, but we don't have an official chapter bank account. We are about to officially open that. Were we still waiting on something from the state?
I think we've got it all.
Okay. So maybe the three of us can coordinate for this weekend potentially to make that official. Then we can really have, food at the monthly meetings and promote it like we've been wanting to. Get reimbursed for that thing, which we'll have working for next meeting. But yeah, so anyways, moving on with committee updates, just to give people sort of a sample of some of the things that our group is involved in, between meetings, because it's not just the monthly meetings. We do a lot. In fact, arguably that's more important than the monthly meetings, is the actual organizing work between them. And so one issue that we've been involved in is, particularly for people that live in like River Hill, King's Contrivance, Hickory Ridge areas. Although in theory, this could affect all of Columbia and all of Howard County, but there's this corporation called W.R. Grace and Company. I had never heard of it before, but it's been headquartered in Columbia since like the 1950s. It's an international chemical company, and it actually has a notorious reputation. There's literally been movies about this company. John Travolta movie in the mid 90s called A Civil Action, because this company, W.R. Grace, has a history of poisoning entire cities. They poisoned an entire city in Montana, entire city in Massachusetts. And so that was what the John Travolta movie was about, is one of the class action lawsuits against W.R. Grace. And so all that to say, this big chemical corporation has a really bad track record. And they're headquartered in Columbia, and they sold off a bunch of land in their Columbia headquarters, 10 or so years ago, developed it into like 300 or so homes, and then after people moved into those homes, they filed for this very controversial application to do a process called pyrolysis or chemical recycling. It's basically, heating plastic and turning it into energy, but there's a lot of, scientists out there who say that this stuff is not safe. The chemicals that it produces as a byproduct is not safe and can cause things like, cancer and other very serious health defects. And so W.R. Grace developed this community, sold the land, developed the community, and then filed for this really controversial and potentially dangerous chemical process. And so once community members who just bought those homes found out about that, they're fighting back against this chemical recycling plant. And so this has been going on for the last few months. Our Revolution Howard County submitted a public comment to the Maryland Department of Environment. Community members have filed a zoning regulation amendment to change the zoning so that these types of research and development activities involving these plastics and the gases it produces couldn't be done in the zoning district. And so that has a public hearing on Tuesday, February 18th at 7 p.m. Encourage people to sign up to testify for that, especially if you live in one of those areas that could be impacted. But again, this company's poisoned entire cities before, so it's not ridiculous to assume that if they have a screw up, it could affect even people outside of just those villages. And so there's a zoning regulation amendment hearing Tuesday, February 18th, 7 p.m. Encourage people to sign up. Community members also filed a zoning complaint against these activities. The county ruled against the community members, but the community members have appealed that ruling, and there's going to be an appeal hearing on March 18th at 5:30 p.m. at the George Howard Building. Last update on this issue is we worked with one of our Howard County state delegates, Jen Terrassa, to introduce 2 bills at the state level to try to combat this project. One would give local jurisdictions the ability to pass stronger clean air bills after they tried to do that in Baltimore City to shut down an incinerator, and then the courts, said local jurisdictions can't pass stronger clean air regulations. And so the state delegate is introducing this state bill to allow local jurisdictions to have that right. And then also she has a bill just to outright ban this pyrolysis or chemical recycling process. Both of those bills have hearings on Wednesday, February 26th at 1 p.m. So if people are interested in getting involved with that, testifying on that, please let me know. Happy to get you plugged in more with that group. Yes. Cedar Creek, it's not technically in Columbia proper, but it's like right next to River Hill. But it's, again, W.R. Grace had this big campus, all this land, and they did a lot of their, chemical research and development activities on that land. But then they also had spare land that they weren't really using, and so they sold that spare land, developed it into a community that people now live, and then filed for this thing. And so that community that they developed, that is Cedar Creek. It's the new community that used to be their land that they've developed. And now all those people feel like they got screwed over. These are expensive, expensive houses in a nice neighborhood. And so people feel like I spent all this money to live, and now I'm being poisoned, and now I'm finding out I'm being poisoned. And so yeah, that's something that's been in the news quite a bit, if people want to learn more. But yes. And any other comments, questions before we move on to the next thing? Okay, cool. So we'll pass the mic to Malik here.
Hi guys, my name is Malik Mohammed. I am an at-large member of our Rev, and I typically handle the pro-Palestinian solidarity work for our organization. I'm also a member of Howard County for Free Palestine, an organization which Jake is also a member of. So some previous recent actions that we've done, we had a poetry for Palestine at Musmos Poet. This was in December. In January, we had a teaching with Dr. Orsami Merton. We did our monthly Board of Education testimonies, a teaching with Pan-African Community Action. We also did the HRC and BOE testimonies on the 16th. So this month, we're going to be doing the Board of Education testimonies on the 13th and 27th, the Human Rights Commission's testimonies on the 20th, and we also have a number of actions that we are hoping to get off for February. They're still in the planning phase, so we haven't announced them yet. But if any of this sounds interesting to you guys, especially if you guys are considering testifying at our local Board of Education or HRC, please reach out to us. And I think now is the perfect time to get involved with everything that we're seeing on the news. Yeah, with that being said, I'll pass the mic back to the next individual.
Although I think Iman, you wanted to add some things.
Yes,
to
of course.
Palestine stuff.
Yes, so, I'm also a member of Howard County for Free Palestine. I'm also applying to become a member of Within a Lifetime in NYC, which is a grassroots organization, Palestinian-led for Palestinian, Arab, and Black liberation and freedom, against oppression, obviously. You know, as we've seen, for those of you who have watched the news, you've seen Trump's very controversial, very ridiculous statement saying he's going to buy Gaza and use it as real estate land. I firmly reject this, as well as surprisingly the Prince of Saudi and the Arab countries that were silent throughout this genocide. This honestly, for someone of my age, is a clear red line, as I'm sure that it doesn't matter how old you are, if your morals are aligned with this movement, it would be a red line for you too. I believe now is the time to organize, collaborate with our revolution in Howard County and organize our first march, not only against Trump's plan for Gaza, but newly against this WR Grace plastics, which is potentially poisoning all residents for Colombia and its surrounding. This is an idea for Malik and an idea for Jake. I am organizing an SJP at my school, Students for Justice in Palestine. We have already had over 10 signatures, and the club is ready to get formed.
That's at HCC.
Yes, Howard Community College. So we are ready. We just need Jake and Malik's and the board's green light, and we will begin to organize for that march. But I highly encourage this. I suggest that we proceed with assertion, but also with caution as well.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Iman. Thank you. Thank you, Malik. Thank you, Iman. So yeah, if people want to get involved with that, especially if you're a student at HCC, exciting news. There's a Students for Justice in Palestine. I think there's not too many pro-Palestine organizations in Howard County, and so even just one extra is a huge thing. And this is a picture of that live poetry night at Busboys and Poets that Howard County Free Palestine organized. Unfortunately, I was not able to be there, but so now our most recent, new endeavor that we've got involved in under the banner of the Board of Education Tracking Committee update. I'm going to pass it over to Tim here. You can come up here or you can do it from there. It's up to you. But he's going to speak on an exciting new campaign that we're getting involved in, that he's been involved in for a little bit.
Here, let's see if I can squeeze.
Maybe next time we should.
Yeah, no. Next time.
So right now, there's a big problem that in Maryland and along with many other states, there's a statewide rule that public sector workers are not allowed to go on strike. And not only that, they could be fired and their union could be decertified for basically doing what unions are for, going on strike. So my DSA chapter is trying to launch a campaign in conjunction with teachers unions and other public sector unions to repeal that law in the Maryland General Session. There's two laws actually. There's that one, and then there's a law that pertains specifically to teachers going on strike. But our goal is to get both of them repealed and allow all public sector workers to go on strike. And our goal initially launched from our May Day 2028 group, because there's a general strike that we're trying to facilitate that's going to happen on May Day of 2028. And with that, there's a lot of unions, Baltimore Teachers Union and Chicago Teachers Union. They put forth a resolution at the American Federation for Teachers National Conference that that promises to align all of their contract end dates in time for May Day 2028 to get ready for a big general strike in order to put a lot of pressure on the powers that be to improve conditions if they want to, if they don't want to lose all their workers at that time. So what we're doing is we're trying to build a coalition of different local chapters, this chapters in Southern Maryland, chapters in Frederick. Because it's going to be a statewide campaign, we need all the help we can get together in support to pressure the Maryland General Assembly to pass a bill to overturn the right to strike, the ban on striking. Our goal is to do it by 2026, and which is going to be very ambitious, which is why we're trying to do it. And then if it doesn't happen, we could also do it by 2027. Because the way it works is the Maryland General Assembly meets every year from January to April. They've had bills trying to overturn the ban that have not passed. So we're trying to build a grassroots organization, a coalition to basically put pressure on them to overturn the ban on public sector unions striking. Right now, our working group is working on a petition that we're going to be canvassing in public venues to try and gather signatures. Basically ask people if they support the right to strike and they think public sector workers should have the right to strike. So we're in the very early stages of this campaign, and we're in the very early stages of trying to launch campaigns in Baltimore, Howard County, Montgomery County, Prince George's County. So talk to Jake or Katz about next steps to get involved in some canvassing around this.
Yes. Thank you, Tim. And yeah, Kat, as a public sector union worker herself, could really benefit, from this. And so whether you're a public sector worker or just, in general, if this is something you'd be passionate about, please reach out to us or Tim or Connor and Sarah from Our Rev are also involved with it. And so we're trying to grow this, make an impact here in Howard County. So yeah, thank you. Unless anybody has any comments, questions about that, then we can move on to the next thing. Okay. The next thing that Tim's also involved in, and is what brought Tim and I together originally, and that is the tenant organizing efforts, the Howard, under the banner of the Howard County Rent Stabilization Coalition, which, be nice if, with the public sector thing, we can form a similar coalition type entity. But, so we formed in 2023 to try to get rent stabilization passed, like other counties had done, Prince George's and Montgomery. James Hubbard was a big part of that early on. And we did get a bill introduced. Unfortunately, it failed. It wasn't as strong as we would like. The bill did not pass either way. We pivoted then to trying to get tenants elected in the upcoming Columbia Association elections, and also trying to create tenant unions. We did get a great tenant named Paulette Pettyford Thomas elected in Oakland Mills. On the village board, she created a tenant committee, first ever, and any village board history, create a tenant committee. Through that tenant committee, we were able to work with her and with tenants at one of the large complexes in Columbia called Columbia Point, and officially formed the first ever tenant union in Howard County history just in December of last year. And so now we are continuing to build the strength of that tenant union, but also try to expand it to other areas. We may do one in Harper's Choices. It's looking like that might be our next base where we build a tenant union. And with the Columbia Association elections coming up, which is, I think, is the last thing we're talking about before we transition to Lawrence. And thank you for your patience, Lawrence. With the Columbia Association elections coming up, again, getting Paulette elected as a tenant really opened the doors for us to do a lot of good organizing work on that issue. And so with these CA elections coming up again, it's another opportunity for us to get some good tenants elected. I plan to I'm a tenant in Dorsey Search. I plan to run where I live. We have somebody from the Palestine group interested in running for Oakland Mills. And we have somebody from a tenant from Harper's Choice that Anna and I met with earlier today, just a few hours ago, and Anna may throw her hat in the ring as well, though she's not a tenant, but it would still be a great representative. But yeah, so all that to say is, we had a big victory with the tenant union in December, and hopefully we can bring that momentum and start having these tenant unions pop up like mushrooms in the rain, and get some of this legislation passed. And so, yeah, Alan, different people running for different positions. Me personally, though, I will likely run for the CA board. Yeah, so, but other people just running for village boards. Harper's Choice, I know that's where you live, Alan. I don't think CA board's up in Harper's Choice this year. I think it's just village board. But yeah, so, yeah, but okay. So if people, Katie, let's talk, more about this. And again, I think, my emphasis, and we're going to talk about Columbia Association in a second, but with the Columbia Association elections coming up, it's a great opportunity to advance all of these different issues that we talked about. Getting yourself on one of these positions, on one of these boards, you are setting yourself up to amplify whatever existing advocacy efforts you're already in. This really is the closest thing we have to an elected, local elected form of government and officials, and people need to start seeing it more as like a city council, more so than an HOA, or really maybe like a hybrid of the two concepts. And with that being said, I will pass it to Kat to talk about Columbia Association updates. And again, that's should be the last thing before we transition to the main event. Yep.
So
No,
I
it's-
have not been really updating these slides. I have been attending Columbia Association meetings, watching them. They can go for 3 to 4 hours. Right now we have really a bunch of people on there who mostly don't care about the residents in Columbia. They care more about this Columbia Association entity and the employees. We're not getting any value for money that we pay them. We are held hostage monthly, or excuse me, every year. You get your annual charge if you are a homeowner. If you lease, it's being passed down to you. If you rent, that cost is being passed down to you. You get what? Well, we don't get free pools. That's extra if you live in Columbia. If you want to join the gym, it's extra. If you live in Ellicott City or somewhere outside, you get a pretty good deal on membership. So if you really think about it, if you live in Columbia and you get a membership, you're actually paying more than outsiders. And what is Columbia Association for? It's for people who live in Columbia. Supposedly that's why they did this. It's a nonprofit, but they're running it like a business. And just to let you know, I'll be running in Wild Lake. So anyone who it lives in Wild Lake that might be on, I'm running for the board. I ran for it last year. I lost by 14 votes, which is such a small amount. 0 people from apartments voted in that election because they do try to make it difficult for them. It is really an apartheid system of voting, because if you own, you get that ballot in the mail, easy peasy. You could do it online, mail it in. If you are a renter, you have to register your lease before the vote on Saturday in person by 4 p.m. How many people have time to do that? Well, this is why they don't vote. And then they don't really understand, well, what am I getting? Well, if you vote for someone like me or Jake, we're going to try and get you at least free outdoor pools. It should be a human right now with global warming, to be able to go to the pool, especially our children should be able to go to the pool. So that's what we're going to fight for. If we get enough people elected, we will get that done. But the village boards right now are same people are always on them. It, who knows what they really do in Wild Lake Village Board. What I can see is they give their pals contracts so they can run programs. So we need regular residents on there, not these people who are co-opted, like the Wild Lake Village Board, the guy who's president is also on the zoning. Conflict of interest completely. And they just got rid of one of our better village board members because she questioned them. They got rid of her. This is what they do. So please, please think about, if you live in Wild Lake, please run for that village board. Let's get rid of these people. And that's about all I have to say.
Yes, thank you, Kat. Well said, well said. And, yeah.
Because the Columbia says, like you said, sometimes we might vote blindly because we don't know, which I know I'm gonna add, I've been here and I need to do it. But how, I guess, what's the makeup of the board of Columbia Association, since, you know, Columbia is so diverse? So I was curious to know, in the age and diversity.
So,
Thank you for that. Thank you for that question. If you watch a meeting a few meetings back, I brought this up. It does not look like Columbia. Most of the people are not renters. Most of the people are older and retired, and they're mostly white. And they really are tone deaf. And they did have an African-American member who was on there that they tried to get him to be the chair. And they blindsided him and were so deceptive that they didn't even tell him they were going to do this. 5 members. So there's 10, 5 of them, yeah.
yeah, 10 villages, each village
Right.
elects one person.
5 of them met separately behind the backs of the others and decided they're gonna get someone else in, which was my opponent, actually, the guy who beat me by only 14 votes. And ran, and he quit because he was so insulted. And this is what they do. And one of the ladies said, well, how do we encourage more people of color? I said, how about you don't run them off when they're willing to be on here? And there was no answer to that. So it's, please do. Absolutely.
Homeowner association. Making it one of a priority for our board to, even if it's.
Exactly. Yeah.
Thank you.
Arden? Okay, yeah. Well,
Talk.
you're in Long Reach, yeah. And so, yeah, we'll talk more. We'll talk. I'm glad you're interested though.
Yes.
But yeah, Sanad also in Long Reach. But yeah, so, yeah, good. And like my last thing I'll say on that, you ask about the diversity and representation on the board. But like, to me, the solution of how we move away from that trend, we have to make this a paid position. Again, like, I think it is appropriate to think of this more as a city council, but if you're not, it almost, village board is a much smaller commitment, but the CA board, that's a much bigger commitment. From my understanding, it's almost like a full-time job, or at the very least a part-time job. And so if you have kids, a family, work full-time, like, most people aren't going to have the privilege or the luxury to serve in that role. And so that's why it does tend to be older, white, retired people who do have that time. And like, so there's really, if you ask me, it's a structural change that needs to be made to make this a more accessible position. Yeah, Iman. I was saying that, this is, it's the Columbia Association Board of Directors, technically a homeowners association, but I think it's really more appropriate to think of it as like a city council. And in most city council or county council, they at least make some amount of money. And so that it's like treated like a job basically, but this does not pay people anything, and yet it does require an unbelievable amount of time to serve in the position. And so that structure like necessarily makes it so that it's only mostly retired people that like have the privilege and the luxury to be able to serve in these types of roles. And that's one of the big reasons why, in my opinion, why it's not reflective of the demographics of Columbia. But yeah, so if you're interested in that, most of the filing deadlines are anywhere from like March 1st to March 14th. So we still got a couple weeks. So please talk to me, talk to Kat. We'll, support you. Most of these races you can win with like 200 votes, which is why the voter suppression of tenants is unacceptable, because if you just turned out an entire apartment complex, that could change an election, but it's hard to do that when in my village, you have to have given your lease to the village board by March 1st, you know, and so it's tough. But yeah, so again, those are all things that we're involved in between meetings and a lot of other things that we didn't talk about. If you're interested in getting involved, please let me know. Another big update is we have decided, you know, I think it's about time we're going to create a group chat for just general member. We have a lot of chats that are just based around these committees, but we don't have a general chat for just our Rev members in general to get involved in. And so we are most likely going to create that. We were, you know, deciding, should we do Discord? Should we do Signal? Real quick, I don't know if people have a strong objection against Discord. Yeah, okay. We might stick with, yeah, it's tougher for new people to get to yeah.
I've been in Discords that have been shut down.
Okay, but yeah, it's a good idea from Sarah and others suggested that we at least create it so we can filter new people, you know, people like Katie and others who, you know, it's a good thing to get in case they're not ready to get involved with one specific thing. But yeah, so yes, if people want to subscribe to our email list, become a dues paying member, follow us on social media, our link tree there, QR code with all of those links and more. And without any further ado, because he's been waiting very, very patiently, I do want to start to transition to the main event of the night, introduce our guest speaker, who is, you know, Mr. Lawrence Grand Prix from Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, Baltimore-based grassroots think tank. I'm sure he can speak a little bit more about, you know, what your guys's mission statement and purpose is, but I do just want to speak for a second about, you know, why we wanted to, you know, invite Lawrence to come, you know, give this presentation, why we feel that it's relevant. And I'll just say, you know, I'm somebody who born and raised in Howard County, but I was not born and raised in Columbia. I was born and raised in Elkridge. And so I'd actually never even, you know, Jim Rouse is a bit of a local legend, but I had never really heard of Jim Rouse, despite living in Howard County, you know, growing up in Howard County, just because I wasn't from Columbia. I wasn't that cued in. And it wasn't until I graduated college in May 2020 and came back, you know, to Howard County, started to get involved politically. And then I started to hear about Jim Rouse, and he really was just talked about in this like legendary mythologized way. If he was and like, because Columbia is such a young city, relatively speaking, it was only developed in like the late 60s, early 70s. You know, Jim Rouse, I think it's appropriate to think of him as the founding father of Columbia. And you know, it's not common where the founder of a city, it's recent enough where people that are still alive today that knew who this person was. And so all that says, I come across a lot of people who knew Jim Rouse personally and had, you know, basically nothing but positive things to say about him and, you know, his vision for Columbia. But me being a very skeptical person, you know, I just started to think like, there's got to be something more to this Rouse guy. Like, it can't be, you know, like, who the hell is that? Like, you know, just overwhelmingly positive and there's nothing to like criticize. Like, it just seemed like, you know, because I'm a skeptical person, it was hard for me to believe that. And so I started to do more research into him, and not to say like, oh, he's like a terrible person, but just to say that like, yes, and just like the founding fathers of America, you know, if you point out that George Washington was a slave owner and maybe wasn't the best guy, that does trigger a certain type of person who has a whole lot of respect for America and the founding fathers. And there is a similar dynamic with Jim Rouse at play. If you criticize the founding father of Columbia, the city that people live in and love, some people do get offended. Even with the promotion of this event, it did, you know, rub people the wrong way. But nonetheless, the things that I came across in my research was the things that I came across in my research. And then also part of me that, you know, that made me a little bit skeptical of maybe there was some more to Rouse's story than is officially told, is just the fact that yeah, he does have this overwhelmingly positive thing. And, you know, he had 4 stated principles or goals of Columbia, and one of them was to make a profit. And now that Rouse is dead and gone, Howard Hughes Corporation bought the Rouse Company, and people say that Howard Hughes Corporation is much more profit driven than Rouse was. But again, Rouse himself said that one of the main motivating goals of Columbia was to make a profit. And so part of me just wondered, like, how much was Rouse just a good marketer and just basically a good businessman and a good capitalist, and really it was profit first, and then his vision of everything else was more just a selling point. All that, you know, I'm not saying that this is definitely the case, but these are just thoughts and theories that were floating in my mind. And so all that, you know, so I had these questions about Rouse. And so all that is to say, when I came across Lawrence's YouTube video that he made on the Black Power Media or Black Liberation Media YouTube channel ran by Dr. Jared Ball, who we helped get on the Hickory Ridge Village Board. You know, when I came across this YouTube video from Lawrence talking about Jim Rouse from a very different perspective than, and again, you know, Lawrence is from Baltimore, so he doesn't have that Columbia perspective, but, you know, hearing, you know, Jim Rouse talked about in a different way was just a huge breath of fresh air, and made me feel like, oh man, I'm not crazy. There are people with other perspectives on this guy that, you know, maybe are not as, you know, glowing and over the top. And you know, it's not even to say Jim Rouse didn't mean well. Maybe he did mean well, but it's to say nobody's perfect. And we should examine, you know, people's impacts that they have even outside of their intent. And so with no further ado, I want to introduce our guest speaker, Lawrence Grand Prix, to talk about, you know, his perspective on Rouse and some of the things that he did, especially the impacts that he had, maybe not as much in Columbia, but in Baltimore, which is, you know, certainly where Lawrence is, you know, well read on. So thank you, Lawrence. Yes. So I
Where
could
do
move
have
this
to
if you want.
Good. Where do I have to be for the Zoom to see?
Oh,
Is it through your computer?
yeah. Do you have like slides prepared or?
No.
Okay. Yeah, you could sit here and then you
Okay.
could put your laptop there if that's okay.
Okay, just making sure.
You need to turn the camera on.
Can you help with that, Francis? I have the screen share. I want to make sure I can see.
Where's this? Where's the Zoom window? Oh. I'm confused.
Sorry,
Oh,
sorry.
no, you're good, you're good.
I think
Oh, down there.
yeah. Can you have your
Start
camera
video.
on?
Start.
Okay, thank you.
Which one is it? Yeah, right here.
Yeah,
Start video.
right there.
Okay, I can hardly.
Thank
read
you,
it.
Lawrence.
I got you.
Yeah.
Okay, yep.
Yeah.
All right. All right, so assuming folks in the Zoom can hear me okay, I'm going to start. I'm going to speak for about 20, probably more like 25 minutes, and I should leave plenty of time for Q&A. So good evening, everybody. My name is Lawrence Grand Prix. I'm Director of Research for Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. We go by our initials, LBS. We're a grassroots think tank based out of Baltimore. We work on a variety of issues impacting the entire state of Maryland. We work from an explicit focus on self-determination for people of African descent, using an understanding of the political economy of racism and white supremacy as the foundation for our work. So that's the perspective from which I'm going to approach Jim Rouse, not so much as a person or a mythological figure, but situating him within a time and a place and within my experience of Baltimore and my work as Director of Research for LBS. So with that, it's important to remember, you know, Jim Rouse raised in large part Eastern Shore, you know, 10s, 20s, 30s. There were actually multiple lynchings on the Eastern Shore in the 30s, 1930s, right? But this is the perspective this person is coming from: a southern state, a border state, a slave state, but also when he comes to the government, it's in the midst of the Cold War. And some of his earliest reform initiatives reflect some of these Cold War liberal imperatives, right? So you have a vision of public housing, you know, government-owned public housing that could have been the dominant vision for blight remediation, could have been the dominant vision for social reform. But in Rouse's work, in the midst of those Cold War imperatives, he is presenting a vision of housing reform in Baltimore, and this is particularly in Sharp Street. A lot of what I'm pulling from is from How the Suburbs Were Segregated by Paige Glauser in 2020. So I'm going to present some context of Baltimore. I'm going to try to land the plane in Columbia a little bit, and I'm going to conclude with an analysis of the work that LBS is doing and how I believe that actually connects to this analysis of Rouse, just to sort of set the stage, right? So if we go back, 1940s, Sharp Street is a historically Black neighborhood, actually very, very close to current day Camden Yards. And as he is doing code enforcement in public housing, he's using notions of disease as a reason why we have to go into these Black communities and clean them out, clean up the housing, clean up the people there. And while he was critical of the idea that code enforcement alone, health code enforcement alone, could be a Black remediation tool, at the end of the day, he promotes this capitalist sort of blight-driven, code-driven vision as opposed to public housing, right? So what he actually says is, what Paige Glauser actually says is, it did not help that one of the main rationales for this project was reducing juvenile delinquency among Black children. So we have, again, this vision of not just capitalist imperatives in the Cold War, but racial anxieties, specifically around juvenile delinquency that could only be solved through the market. And that's going to be important when we talk about the work LBS is doing, right? So if we jump to the 50s, we're going to go to another Rouse project. It's in Waverly. Waverly is a mixed neighborhood near Johns Hopkins University. If you know the old Memorial Stadium, 33rd Street, near that part of town. So I actually do want to read a quote from Glauser's book. I do believe it's actually pretty stunning, the role he plays and how she describes, how people at the moment describe the impact of Rouse's work. So she writes, quote, Rouse saw urban redevelopment in Baltimore as a business opportunity. Rouse's plan replaced 197 units of housing for 847 people with 291 apartments designed for over 1,000 people. The Housing Authority of Baltimore City, HABC, handled all relocation services on behalf of the Baltimore Redevelopment Commission. Black owners outnumbered white homeowners 19 to 10. The majority of property owners, white and Black, thought their properties were worth more than the city paid for them. 10 Black homeowners and 5 white homeowners hired attorneys to negotiate higher offers from the city. All of them secured higher offers. The HABC assured residents that some of this place will be relocated in Waverly. This turned out to be possible only for white residents. All of the 291 new housing units were segregated for whites only. Black residents of Waverly expressed their frustrations with being displaced for segregated housing. A city survey found the prime reason displaced Black households disliked the redevelopment was the city not letting them live in the new units. The Baltimore Redevelopment Commission passed the blame to the new private development company, which selected its own tenants. News of redevelopment segregation reached the Urban League, which condemned the project for its racial segregation. Developers remained unmoved. Horn says the Waverly Project study demonstrated the issue of federal facilitated Negro clearance about as sharply as is conceivable. Clarence Mitchell of the NAACP cited Waverly as an example of federal housing policy instituting a, quote, monumental program of segregation, end quote, that succeeded in doing what, quote, the courts have forbade state legislatures and city councils to do, and what the Ku Klux Klan has not been able to accomplish by intimidation or violence, end quote. So this is Clarence Mitchell. This is, some people know him, the 101st senator, one of the folks who helped negotiate the Civil Rights Act of '64, talking about a program that Rouse is connected to in Baltimore from this very stark perspective, him doing what the Ku Klux Klan couldn't do. And I think that's a textbook example of racism, not as an example of personal animus, but as an example of how you function within the impacts of your advocacy and how you allow institutions to build things, right? Again, we're dealing, so let's actually start from there. So we have Clarence Mitchell. We have another incident in Cross Keys. Cross Keys is another Baltimore development. It's almost, it feels a bit like a proto-Columbia in that it was built more as an upscale residency. They actually had Jewish quotas in Cross Keys. They did not have racial quotas, but the explicit framework of it was we will allow a few highly vetted, essentially elite Black folks into Cross Keys and not have it formally be segregated under the assumption that the few highly paid Black folks will create cover for what we all agree will be a predominantly white development, right? So many people see that as a framework for capitalist development, because again, you can make a logic-based liberal market argument that if the development was too black, well, then it would fail and the market forces would make it so there'd be no new housing. And I think this is the example of good intentions and a vision of the market as essential to creating change led to this problem, right? So now we actually want to get to the things that were talked about. The piece that I actually wrote was about a development in the 80s and 90s. And I'm going to set the stage for the players on the board and the forces on the board, because it's going to be essential to understand what the critique of that development actually was, right? So in the 1960s, you have a grassroots bottom-up movement towards not just getting redistribution from the government, not just getting investment, but community control of that investment. So you have one of the people protesting Cross Keys was the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE. One of the leaders of CORE was Walter Carter. Walter Carter is the father, some of you may know Jill Carter, the former senator from the 41st district in northwest Baltimore City. So Walter Carter, working with CORE, specifically in the late 60s, led, many of you know about the war on poverty, the poverty programs. These were very different from different locations. These were very different depending upon what they actually did, who ran the program, based upon how the city's political formation actually determined who ran the program. So Walter Carter and the Baltimore poverty programs, the Community Action Agency, was one of the very few that was noted as being responsive to community. As we just talked about, you can have a program that's ostensibly giving community empowerment, but if you're not actually giving the people who are effective control of the resources, all you've basically done is create another class of people to rule in those people's stead, right? So in the midst of, and it's all gonna come back to Rouse, Walter Carter pushing the Community Action Agency in Baltimore City to be more responsive to community, he is up for nomination to permanently run those community action agencies in the 70s. And then City Council President, future Mayor, future Governor, William Donald Schaefer, blocks his nomination. And he blocks his nomination in large part, if you read the writings of people of the time, because they want control of that money. And they want control of that money to essentially give it to Rouse. Because of course, Rouse is doing the Eaton Harbor at the time. So you have a trade-off between, again, this vision of development that can, spur jobs within a capitalist vision of, a service economy, but, explicitly focused on the altruistic benefits to community, service jobs for people who need them. But that money was seen as wanting to go downtown as opposed to putting money in communities themselves, right? So ironically, and again, of course, Columbia is happening all during this time. You know more about it than I do. But it is the backdrop of all of this in terms of this, Tierra Nellis, this essentially farm ground, at least in terms of the mythology of Columbia, this barren ground that a beautiful interracial integrated city was built upon. So you fast forward to the 80s. You have an opportunity to get some investment from the federal government in Baltimore to do urban renewal better. James Baldwin famously called urban renewal Negro removal. And Schaefer being a potential prime example of that framework, when you got the money from the federal government, this would have been Clinton, to try to do something different, who had the capacity to handle $100 million to rebuild the slums? It wasn't anybody from the community. As much as the churches tried to unite and build, what's the name of the organization, to build capacity, they felt Rouse was brought in, and specifically enterprise partnerships, the nonprofit wing of Rouse, right? So here we have a so-called nonprofit, seemingly altruistic development entity coming into Baltimore. And the entire piece that I write is about this development, the so-called Nehemiah development. Some of you, if you read your Bible, Nehemiah was apparently one of the prophets who wanted to rebuild the wall of Israel, right? The Jerusalem. And so the theory was, we're working with the Black church, enterprise would come in and reinvest in this community. But largely the critique that I want to present is that Rouse viewed Baltimore very similar to how he viewed Columbia, Tierra Nellis. Blank ground for him to manifest a destiny, not realizing there was already indigenous community institutions, connections, capacity, and culture in that place where he wanted to place redevelopment. So I'm just going to read one more quote. This is actually from a book by Harold McDougall called Black Baltimore, speaking about the Nehemiah development and the conditions on the ground. Quote, community resident Althea Young carried out a street survey in Sandtown. This is Sandtown, Winchester, which is a neighborhood. This may sound familiar. This is a neighborhood Freddie Gray lived and unfortunately died in. 10 years ago, we had the Baltimore uprising. This would have been in the 90s. And my argument is that, unfortunately, far from preventing an uprising, this development actually created the conditions that produced the uprising. But I'll go back to the quote. Community resident Althea Young carried out a street survey of Sandtown with my assistance, Harold McDougall's assistance, in the summer of '91. The diversity we observed in our first assessment was amazing. We passed evidence of Muslim and Black nationalist activity, a Muslim carryout on Carey Street, a Nation Builders bookstore on North Avenue, home of a Rastafarian with a Haile Selassie emblem and handwritten messages on his windows, a Black business row on North Avenue across from Nation Builders bookstore, a Black street vendor who lived in the area coming out around lunchtime and staying until dusk, Arabers, Black vendors who sell fruits, vegetables, and fish on a horse-drawn wagon in West Baltimore gather on Winchester Street, a stable of Sandtown senior Arabber who the street name is Fatback. There they collect their produce and merchandise to sell on the streets of Sandtown. Fatback stable was later bulldozed to make way for the Nehemiah Project. And I think that's an example of fundamentally what's happening here. And unfortunately, this is not just Rouse, this is common on the liberal, and I would say even people who call themselves leftist. The inability to see indigenous capacity in institutions within Black communities is worth investing in. Because think about this Arabers, maybe you remember it if you watched The Wire, and a Black indigenous solution to food insecurity, to food deserts. And as opposed to seeing that as something worth investing in, Rouse says, Tierra Nellis, there's nothing worth engaging in there, wipe it all out, right? So if we actually look at what happens with Rouse in the 80s and 90s in Sandtown with Nehemiah, the social connections of the people are not seen as tangible enough to be worth investment in big foundations. They can see buildings, they can see houses, they can see markets, but the actual connections that secure people, that give them stability, that secure networks, to give people opportunity and stability, those are intangible. So those are not something that are invested in. And what you get is building some housing, which actually in the eyes of many residents actually sucks out the social capital from the heart of Sandtown to the neighborhoods where the new housing is built. So far from solidifying community, you disperse it. Because the people who are stable enough to buy the new housing are not leave the rest of the community behind, which creates actually more instability in that community. So I actually have a piece written on our website, lbsbaltimore.com, that explains they actually did redo the market. They put actually sort of like a North African, Arab, Afrocentric print on the market, but they don't actually focus on bringing people from the community into ownership of the market. They actually brought in a Dollar General. And some of you may know critiques of Walmart. Dollar Generals act like mini Walmarts, undercutting indigenous businesses, undercutting them on price, selling these packaged goods at bulk in a way that makes it hard for indigenous business to compete. But I think the most pernicious thing about Nehemiah, and again, this is understandable from the perspective of the 90s, you want to protect your investment. But how do they protect their investment? They have this map, and if you see it on the website, they have it called drug nuisance abatement zones. And they just have extended police presence into the neighborhood where they're investing. So again, we're seeing mass incarceration in the neighborhood of Sandtown, where up to 20% of the Black men within the 18 to 50 age group, according to Todd Clear's book, Coercive Mobility. 20% of the Black men are in jail, not on the box, not on surveillance, not on probation, they're in jail. And it's not despite a lack of investment, it's because of investment. So that's the other message I want to bring to you all as Our Revolution, Bernie, leftist. It's not just the lack of investment that creates conditions that lead to uprisings. It's investment that does not respect the community's indigenous capacity to be able to invest in itself and control the investment, right? Because think about what we're having here. They call Columbia and Rouse's vision the Garden City vision. In the midst of the Garden Cities, what is the message being communicated to Sandtown? It is that if you are not able to grow in the garden we built, you're a weed, and we have to dig you out. So I'm going to read a quote to you. And the quote is, the only problem with colonialism is that it got nationalized. Colonialism's charter company style is profitable. Colonialism as a government department is a disaster. That's from Curtis Yarvin. Anybody ever heard of Curtis Yarvin? Curtis Yarvin is one of the intellectual architects of the anarcho-capitalist right-wing second Trump regime. He essentially believes we need a new monarch to fundamentally undermine democracy in order to save the republic from an anarcho-capitalist perspective. Curtis Yarvin graduated from Wildlake. And this is a talk that is trying to give you language to understand how that could happen. How could the architect of Trump's second term come from Columbia? I would argue it's because of the vision that sees, again, Tierra Nellis, empty ground, and one person has the authority to build a vision from their mind into the world. That's what it was with Rouse. Many people say that's what it is with Trump. And that mindset, that vision creates the context in the political economy where violence is possible. I just got like 5 more minutes and then I'll get right to you, right? So with that, I want to actually talk about some of the things we're working on and how it can reflect some of the lessons that we should learn from the limitations of Rouse's interventions and developments, right? So one of the biggest things, again, is we have to recognize that Derek Bell says racism is a permanent fixture of American society, and that the advancements we've made have come from what he calls interest convergence, right? Some people see that as a pessimistic vision of America. What I see that as is we need to, as a left, recognize that oppressed communities have their own specific interests, and we need to ensure that they see their interest in progressive redistribution that respects their sovereignty and self-determination so that we can build the actual multiracial class-based movement that does not disrespect people's calls for self-determination and community control. Because Nehemiah was sold to that community as essentially progressive economic redistribution. A lot of that money came from the feds, but it came in a way that was so top-down, technocratic, and disrespectful of community that they were hurt by that investment. And now it's hard for them to buy into what many people in this room might be trying to sell, right? So this history gives you some context for that, but explains some of the things we're seeing on the ground. For example, as we said before, it is specifically fear of use deviance that animated Rouse's first development. Right now, we're seeing an attempt to revive the Inner Harbor with billions of dollars of investment and a renewed focus on criminalizing Black youth specifically in the state of Maryland. So the state of Maryland incarcerates as a percentage of its populations more Black people, and especially Black youth, of any state except for Mississippi and Alabama. So as we call ourselves as progressive Democratic Party trifecta, we have a mass incarceration system that reflects the Southern slave roots that Rouse grew up with in the Eastern Shore. So we're calling for people to support SB 422, which would limit the ability to automatically charge youth as adults for a slew of different things in the state. Right now, for almost 30 different charges, youth are automatically charged as adults, limiting their ability to access it in the juvenile justice system. If you're actually in an adult facility, because of constitutional rulings, you're not supposed to be in sight or sound of adult offenders, which basically many times mandates you in solitary confinement if you're a youth offender in an adult facility. And think about, again, the trauma and the pain that that causes for a young person that puts them on a life path for negative life outcomes. So it's actually a better public safety strategy to start in the juvenile system. If they need to be waived up, if they are a public safety threat, you can waive them up to the adult system. But start in the juvenile system with the access to resources so we as a community can take care of our youth, not the prison industrial complex. And it's the lack of precision sometimes that I think sometimes leftists bring to these conversations that means community don't see folks like Our Revolution showing up for issues like this, which makes it hard for us to invest in the progressive redistribution agenda that we might agree with, but we say we have specific issues because we've specifically been targeted by these policies. So the last thing I want to bring up is our work around reparations. So we actually wrote the part of the bill for the cannabis legalization bill that reinvested tax revenue in the communities impacted by the war on drugs, communities like Sandtown, Winchester, right? And it was specifically created with the vision of Walter Carter's work of the community action agencies in mind to build local control into the bill. So that money actually goes to localities. It doesn't stay in Annapolis. And the localities get the money based upon the percentage of cannabis arrests and convictions that happen in those localities. So the people hurt the most get the most money. But it's not just money, it's control, right? So we actually have a reparations commission in Baltimore City, and that model has been replicated in many places, including Howard County, that can actually give the community control over where it puts that money. So were actually working, they actually want to raise the cannabis tax in the state of Maryland, but they actually are limiting the amount of that tax increase that goes to the community reinvestment fund, because they want it in the general fund. Right? And it's things like that that we would love to see more groups like Our Revolution speak up on. Because it's not that we don't support taxing the rich. It's not that we don't support increasing the cannabis tax. We're one of the lowest in the country. It is that when you have people that see this broad-based economic redistribution directly investing in that community, that makes the policy more durable and raises support for the progressive taxation I think many people in this room want to see, right? So given we talked about the nonprofit industrial complex, so much of what people call economic redistribution actually goes to the nonprofit industrial complex. And I think one thing that I want to end on is to really understand that it is with the rise of majority Black cities that the nonprofit industrial complex rises, specifically to take the control of public money out of the hands of those Black politicians that get elected. Because it's the boards and the foundations that control the money when it goes to nonprofits. They don't reflect the community, but the number one funder of nonprofits is actually the government. It's not rich people, because they have been empowered to do the social service work that used to be from the city back in the community action agency days, right? So when you go to Annapolis and you're pushing for education reform, when you're pushing for progressive taxation, we would love to talk to folks about ways to understand this vision of community control as part of a broader progressive movement, to make sure the left doesn't replicate the limitations of Rouse, to make sure the left doesn't create the same sense that these folks who may not live in my community, may not understand my community, want to create solutions for my community, as opposed to giving my community the power to create solutions for itself. I think that's where Rouse's limitations were. I think that's where sometimes the left limitation is. And I think our organization is offering some of our perspectives to make sure that we can move forward together. So with that, I think we have time for Q&A.
Thank you, guys. Excellent, excellent. Yeah, so I know a lot of people in the audience have questions, but I do just want to abuse my power as the co-chair to ask like 1 or 2 or 3 questions that I have for you.
Let's do 2.
Okay, 2. Yeah, thank you. So, yeah, sorry. Okay, fine, then say. Okay, then. Okay, then you could ask your question. You could ask your question.
My question, Lawrence, is, first of all, I appreciate what you brought. It wasn't about Jim Rouse, but I appreciate what you brought. I feel like it was bait and switch. Come to Howard County from Baltimore, your home, told me before we began, you never lived here.
Yeah.
You don't know Columbia at all. You didn't know Jim Rouse. I've lived in Columbia for 43 years. I know Jim Rouse. I know the people who worked in his organization. Many of them did. I struggled as I listened to you. I struggled to understand where you were coming from with Jim Rouse, because I didn't hear you talking about Jim Rouse. I heard you talking about Baltimore, and that's nice, but not Jim Rouse. So I guess as a teacher in Howard County in Columbia for 12 years, a lot of my students, including, as I mentioned to you before we began, including black students, Hispanic students, I asked them before I came, I asked them on Messenger, what should I ask this guy who's coming here with a topic that he calls whitewashed?
He didn't call it that, just to be clear. He did not name the title of the event.
He run by?
No, and I'm sorry, I didn't do that once, but yeah, but
That's
continue. Yeah, okay, I'll take responsibility for that.
In any event, they tell me, and this is unanimous, by the way, Brian, this is unanimous. They tell me that the atmosphere, the interracial love that they found in Columbia, that they were raised in, they tried when they became adults and went out into the world, they tried to find that, they couldn't. They couldn't find it anywhere else. Do you know what Jim Rouse used to begin?
Just as a reminder, we said 1 minute and I don't want you to monologue. No, I'm sorry, we're gonna instill these ground rules, so you have 10 more seconds to get to the question.
You introduce him.
You didn't introduce yourself. You didn't introduce yourself. You have 10 more seconds.
You don't care. I will.
We're gonna have to ask you.
No.
I have a question. And so, just a minute.
Hold on, Josh.
So when he began his board meetings, you know how he began every board meeting?
No.
He would look at his board members and he'd say, let's remember what our business is here. Our business is the business of love. If we get that right, the profits will follow. So yes, was a capitalist, absolutely. How else would he get a loan from his buddy at Connecticut General Life Insurance Company to buy 15,000?
Oh, no, I mean, I think I understand the context
Yeah,
of your
yeah,
question, and I
yeah.
think,
I
I think this is the common, I think, reality that people are struggling with. This is a person who many people say personally was not racist, but I think I laid out, these were his reforms, this was the impact he had. He was operating within a political environment. And I would raise the question of, again, think about the white flight that many people say Colombia enables, but also the policing architecture that many people feel necessitated the securing of the suburbs. That produces the mass incarceration we see in Maryland as a state. And that's not just Baltimore, that's the entire state of Maryland has this massive racial disparities when it comes to all these different types of crime, to create the sense of security that may lead to the interracial relationships you see in a space like Colombia. And I think that what's happened is that the violence and suffering has been invisibilized, and the narrative of the personal warmth gets mythologized, right? So I'm here saying that the state of Maryland, not just the city of Baltimore, but the state of Maryland is having policy and practice that reflects these racialized disparities and a fundamental dehumanization of Black life. Because if you have to come to Colombia to experience warmth and humanity, what does that mean for the people who are never going to get to Columbia? What does that mean for the people who are quote unquote left behind in Baltimore? How do we have a vision so that people who maybe don't want to live in Columbia, they want to live amongst people that look like them and come from their own culture and experience, can build for themselves that sense of warmth and connection? What I'm saying is that the mythology of Rouse makes it hard for us to see the policy solutions that make that other world possible. And the violence that Rouse's world necessitates becomes invisible. So I'm not saying that we ignore what you brought to the table. I'm saying that there's so much left off the table that we need to have a policy and practice that centers on everything else that wasn't the personal experience in those moments. I know you had a question.
Yeah. I'll let it. Okay, so you sure? No, mine was more of a statement, not really a question. But to me, I feel like, when I seen the Whitewash, it did, like you said, got me here, which I've been coming to other events, so no. So to me, I feel like I heard the connection with Rouse, what you're saying. But for me, like I said, I chose to live in Columbia because of the diversity. I learned about the history of the villages and things like that and how it came to be. But the one thing I wanted to say was, to me, it wasn't as bad as I thought maybe I would hear, you know what I mean? But y'all both kind of said that might not have been intentional with maybe from the capitalistic things with money. And like you said, you have to have money, have investments to build. And what I heard true was Columbia, from what I understand again, was more farmland, ground up build. But then when you talked about Baltimore, you already had people there, which to me ties into what goes on today with, like, I'm from Pennsylvania, my hometown is going through, they call it revitalization, but it's gentrification. And to me, that's what it made me think about when you talked about there's this area, there is a need, but there are people here. And it sounds like Rouse might have been somewhat a part of that, or he was connected to people that were part of that or something. Is that what you were saying?
Well,
That
Rouse,
Nehemiah and what you were
well,
talking about?
Enterprise,
Just making
which
sure
is,
that-
yeah,
making sure I'm hearing.
Enterprise, which is Rouse's nonprofit
Okay.
development wing,
So
they do
gotcha.
Nehemiah.
Yeah, gotcha.
But in the 50s, with things like Cross Keys, again, that development that he helped sponsor has like racial quotas for Jews,
Gotcha.
right? So he's directly part of that discriminatory covenant framework.
So, okay, so that's what I'm saying. So he was part of that. So to me, again, I feel like what I heard wasn't really intentional, but to me, it does go back to today. There's a lot of people who feel like they want to help communities. And then when the community says, that's not what we want, you're ungrateful, you don't want to do better. And it's like, no, when you don't include the community, you know, you get what you get. Like I said, my hometown, yeah, I'm gonna stop. But it's called revitalization, but really it's gentrification. And it's like everywhere around has built up. But this one community, which is predominantly, like I'm from Chester County, Pennsylvania, it's a predominantly black, the only determined city in Pennsylvania. And the highest black, you know, concentrated there, and that's what's happening. So to me, what you said, it reminds me of that. When you forget about those who are here versus Columbia, flat slate, you know, the maker. So that's something to me that still goes on today, and a lot of things. Just from my own personal experience in my hometown, to bring it forward.
I want to relate to what you're saying. You talk about like when like Philadelphia, for example, talking about the quote unquote revitalization when the reality is it's gentrification. You know, I've noticed this from a lot of documentaries that I've seen and a lot of collections, debates that I've seen, where they tend to make these words up like revitalization, for example. I've seen this happen when politicians would talk about invading other countries, like Iraq, for example. George Bush said that, you know, like after 9/11, this is a very, you know, sensitive topic, but after 9/11, he pointed the finger at, you know, Saddam Hussein was, or Osama bin Laden, sorry, and Saddam Hussein, when they said they had quote unquote weapons of mass destruction, and we want to liberate the people. And don't get me wrong, Saddam was a tyrant towards his people, but a lot of Iraqis and a lot of Americans at the time felt very uncomfortable with Western presence being in places it didn't belong in the first place. Yeah, you know, they massacred over 1 million Iraqis. They killed them. It was labeled a genocide and an ethnic cleansing. But no one talked about it, and they called it Operation Freedom for Iraqis, when in reality it was the bitter opposite. So, you know, this tie that the gentrification has, it may be in a different branch of this lie that politicians are advocating for. But another thing also is, you know, it sounds a lot like a lot of, you know, the people that have control over this, will, you know, a hidden role in oppressing people. And who have we seen recently voice his role in oppressing people and being a neo-Nazi? Elon Musk.
Yeah, I was going to say the notes I have, I didn't get to all of them, was the vision is sometimes like terraforming. And that's almost like the vision of Nehemiah, is that while they have Nation Builders bookstore, they already have a nation. It was seen as a broken nation, a failed state. And the structural violence of neoliberalism, the hollowing out of the tax base that create the conditions where people felt something like Nehemiah had to come in, reflect the inability to see the indigenous building that Alcia's analysis of the indigenous institutions of Sandtown pointed out as worth investing in. Which I think is very similar to why we don't have equitable trade relationships with the rest of the world, because we don't see them as nations to be invested in. They see them as places to extract resources. So now when we see Baltimore, we see they have $6 billion of development planned for Baltimore, because the waterfront real estate, the still relatively affordable East Coast city, is a asset to be mined. And part of that is bringing in the police presence, is bringing in to protect your investment.
That's something that.
Well, that's something that we oppose, right? And I think that's part of why we want to try to expand the coalition, because, you know, we're with the ACLU, we're with a variety of groups fighting in the State House on a variety of issues. And we want to try to connect those to the folks working on economic justice. We've written extensively actually about Zionism and the connections between the control of people overseas and the policing of people here in Baltimore. So I think that's a connection we make very explicitly. And I think it's something you have to think about with this conversation.
And just before you answer another question, people in the chat are asking if you could repeat the question before you answer it.
I will be sure to do that.
Thank you.
I got you. Always got to think about saying.
Yeah, there is one question there, if I could read it out. Okay.
Mhm.
Given all the other players in this time, do you see Rouse as the main driver of the ills you describe? And two, much of Enterprise's work that you described was after Rouse
Yeah.
was forced out.
That is true. I don't see him personally as like some particularly malevolent force. I think again, within Cold War imperatives, within capitalist visions of urban renewal, he was a conduit through which those things flowed. I think, you know, the mythologizing of him afterwards, I mean, I think it's important to dissect in the face of that, right? I mean, even like I read his chunks of his biography, and it sort of says like, we just moved faster than the residents of Sandtown were able to move with us, right? So still that progressive vision that like we knew where we were going, it just couldn't keep up. So even in his biography, I think there's a need to again absolve him of the structural violence that Enterprise and his interventions produced with the personal narratives of him, right? So I do think it is important to evaluate him personally, because I actually didn't know about the Waverly development and how, again, he did what the Ku Klux Klan couldn't do, right? That was on him. That was his baby, right? So I think that people like Clarence Mitchell have such a vehement analysis of him at the time, I think goes to show what was actually happening and putting him in the context of, again, 50s, Cold War, Red Scare, but just again, the violence of urban renewal is violence we don't always truly understand, because again, I think it's almost like we don't see there's anything there that people could possibly be doing that's productive. And I don't think that's changed since then, right? So I don't think it's a question of him personally. I think it's a question of how we envision the maps of the world, where we still view places like Baltimore as Tierra Nullis, and we imagine we can just drop a money bomb and wipe out the slums, and whether it's to build a casino or build a high-speed maglev train. These visions of the inability to value those communities, I think, is what I'm trying to put central on the table as the core thing for us to focus on.
Really appreciate bringing this texture about Jim Rouse. I live in Columbia. I'm new to Columbia, but I've been a Howard County resident for 20 years. This warm and fuzzy feeling about we're so great here. I'm in an interracial marriage, so that's one aspect of it. Is very, very real and very difficult to deal with when we're facing the problem we're seeing now. You mentioned Curtis Yarvin. For those of you who don't know, I don't know too much about him, but first time I heard about him was when the guy who wrote a J.D. Vance biography mentioned him in a way that's completely benign. J.D. Vance is so interesting. He's very right-wing conservative and opportunistic, but he reads Curtis Yarvin's reading. So that biographer talked about him as if this was some benign figure, until I actually heard a podcast called Behind the Bastion about Curtis Yarvin.
Yeah.
So he could very much single-handedly, through Peter Thiel, through J.D. Vance, through all these band of criminals that are so powerful now, they can just make my interracial marriage and anyone else's marriage illegal pretty soon. So for those of us living in Columbia, especially telling everyone with a ultimate pride, understandable, we're in a utopia society, to sit in that discomfort, knowing what you just told us, and to learn more about it, I think it's absolutely necessary. Otherwise, we can't move forward. We're just soaking in our own little pride and our little unchecked privilege. And that is very abundantly clear to me after I moved to Columbia, because there's many, many layers of all the history. If we don't know, we don't know what we don't know, right? So I really, really do appreciate your taking the time to tell us what's going on behind that, even if it's not entirely all in Columbia.
Yeah. Thank you.
To me, like Elon Musk's control, Yarvin is to Vance. You know, whatever the guy's name is, Curtis or whatever. It's the same. It's almost like if something happened to Trump, or what I call him, and Vance moved up, then we won't have Elon, we'll have this guy behind it. And it's good if you look up his name and read about it.
Yeah.
I can't remember how, but then after a while, they asked my name. Behind him, because I wanted to know personally, like, did you know him? Was he the same in school? What person? Because I'm like thinking Columbia, was he really that minded at Wild Lake? You know, and she told me about the difference of Wild Lake from then till now, and how things have changed in some years. But he's definitely somebody to look up to. But I mean, not look up, to look up and find out more about to understand. You got Elon Musk here, and you got him and Vance's here. So think about that from where we are and who's driving behind both of them.
Yeah, we'll go right here, then we'll go right here.
Fair housing acts and housing discrimination is illegal in the first place.
Mhm.
Secondly, you have, and in the suburbs, the big developers have been the people who make sure that there was segregation. On their business calculations in 1950 would have been, well, it makes sense to keep blacks out because there are too few of them. It's not a market, I'm not losing anything, and a perception was that it meant that there was going to work.
Mhm.
But when you get to the sixties, in the late sixties, well, it's different. There are many more black people who can afford housing.
Mhm.
It turns out that many white people don't care. And if you have a greenfield site, you have no local community to live there. So, if you go to Columbia, right down in Northern Virginia, you have Reston, which is exactly the same time period, exactly the same diversity.
Mhm.
Black people because there's no Virginians had it, but it was always diverse,
Mhm.
there was never any discrimination. And Bob Simon, who was the Jim Rouse of Russia, was a nasty, grumpy old guy. Okay, not, I mean, there are some
Mhm.
people think he was, things to be as just the opposite image of us. So
Yeah.
it was the mark, it was the
Mhm.
demographics, it's not, I mean, Rouse was a good businessman, he
Yeah.
recognized that potential clientele had changed. The law had changed and he went with it. So, I mean, I think you have to think in bigger terms of how the market works, how the society, things are changing.
Absolutely. I would say, in addition to that, you're absolutely right. So the question is, the comment is about seeing Columbia within the context of larger market dynamics. Other places like Reston also were created. The elimination of housing discrimination allows for these interracial communities to thrive, and building it from the ground up meant there weren't as much so-called NIMBY or restrictive covenants there. So I think all that's true. I would juxtapose a place like Columbia to something like Soul City in North Carolina, right? 'Cause I think that also maybe gets me back to where I want to sort of continue to present my analysis. Soul City was a planned community explicitly for Black community self-determination in North Carolina with a similar framework. I think they actually talked to Rouse, right?
It's just saying they're closing at 9.
Okay, I got you. So yeah, so one of the former civil rights leaders, Floyd McKissick, actually talked to Rouse to get help with building up this community. And despite essentially offering infrastructure improvements to the communities through improving the water system, they were denied access to the market because, again, they were perceived as not as a good investment, right? So we have this asymmetry between the ability to see Black people building for themselves as a worthwhile investment in the market and something like Columbia, right? So I would also say, to conclude, that seeing investments in Baltimore and things like Site Black Baltimore and things like Parity Homes, these are indigenous Black Baltimorean solutions to our housing crisis. For example, in Baltimore, some of the Black housing advocates have actually pushed back against community land trust because a lot of the community land trust advocates are not from that community, and they focused on renting, affordable renting within the land trust. But many of the Blacks will say, look, this is America. We don't have a lot. We want assets that we own. And we're not all, like we said, we're not all poor. Many of us can afford to own homes. And we respect the land trust. We want stuff off the market too, but we want to focus on shared equity. So as we live in the house and pay and improve the housing, we're getting some of the benefit of that work, right? So I think that's where I kind of want to, again, push the analysis to, that it's not, you have to remember there's always an alternative vision of what is possible if you believe oppressed people are human. So it's not that Columbia is horrible, it's that we should not have needed Columbia. We should not need to move to Columbia. We should have a variety of solutions that reflect a variety of impulses that we as a community can choose for ourselves how we want to live in the world. And I think that's where we have to evaluate the pedestaling and mythologizing of Columbia as the solution, and what that might mean for what people think about the people who are not in places like Columbia.
But what you're saying is like a better, yeah, I want to reiterate what you said, like, the oppressed people didn't need this like step forward, but also a secretive step back or regress in social, you know? Like, is that right?
I would say that Columbia reflects a particular vision of what interracial progress looks like in America. And that vision is friendly to larger capitalist market dynamics, and it locks itself into, which again, I didn't want to make too much the focus on my talk because we get trapped there so much. This vision of emotionally Black people should want to live around white people. Right.
Yeah.
And it's not that there's anything wrong with that, if you choose to. But the idea is that we shouldn't have to. Also, I don't think that, given the nature of self-segregation, objectively, it's very difficult for me to understand how we could scale up something like Columbia.
Yeah.
So just pragmatically, we must have a
We'd rather
solution.
have self-determination.
Just pragmatically,
Communism, socialism, all of
some solution for the neighborhoods that were impacted with things like targeted hyper-incarceration with the war on drugs. All those people are not going to move to Columbia, right? So we need to have visions of investment that allow those folks to choose for themselves the vision of how they want to rebuild their communities, right? So that's where the community repair and restitution fund comes in from the cannabis sales. And I think that's where things like taxing capital gains, increasing taxes on the wealthy, which the governor has supported in his budget. But it's not just a question of getting the revenue. It's a question of where do we put the revenue? And how do we put the revenue in containers that give community the self-determination to choose for themselves how they rebuild their social fabric and solidify their communities? We're gonna go right here, then right here.
Read a lot about the people who did things wrong, but I hear so rarely about organizations that are doing the investment in self-determination well.
Yeah.
I thought Fight Blight wrong in Baltimore, but I was
Yes.
wondering if you could name any others that you're like,
So-
this is a great example.
Yeah, so Fight Blight, I think, is doing really good work. They have something called Stop Oppressive Seizures. So in Baltimore, in many parts of the state, you can actually lose your home if you don't pay your water bill, right? So, and again, Baltimore owns a lot of its water, but its billing system is really janky. So you got a lot of people who, again, you got grandma's house, grandma can't pay the water bill, and they're taking it. And so there's actually a bill that, and Baltimore City has got some protections on that. If it's like your own sort of owner occupied property, they're not supposed to sell it out from under you for things like water bills. There have been attempts to try to get that protections extended statewide. So everyone has that protection, but what they actually get told is that no, it's like, we actually need the water bills and to be able to take property as a tool to do blight remediation. And potentially to give to someone like Enterprise, like a good nonprofit developer, right? So I think these are the connections I'm trying to make between this story and other things. So, so I would also look to, and again, because this is Howard County, you all have your version of the Reparations Commission. It passed last year. They have, I believe, I don't know if they've staffed it yet, but the idea again is that every county has had their own impact from the war on drugs. So someone in Annapolis or even someone from Baltimore should not tell Howard County what to do with its money. So looking at what you all can do locally to push that money places where it could actually be reparative of the war on drugs, I think is something that could be a good place to look. Because again, like also with Fight Blight, they're trying to push a land bank. So a land bank is a model that allows for basically a quasi-public entity to be able to more quickly acquire land that's like, people are flipping houses and doing speculation, or just, they've had the vacant property for 20, 30 years, more quickly take it off the market, have it under some sort of quasi-public ownership, have it be redeveloped in a responsible way. Now that can go either way. That can be a tool of community empowerment or a tool of gentrification. And different people in places like Detroit have different visions of what land banks can do. But I think things like that, things like, again, just like what they're doing in Montgomery County with the sort of alternative vision of public housing. I'm sure people have heard about that. And again, there's just so many different solutions on the table. Social housing, I think is what it's called, that can be presented. But what I'm saying is that there's not going to be one big shot solution. Like, I don't think we should focus on scaling up Montgomery County thing 20, 50,000 times, right? Different communities are going to want different things to reflect their vision of what works for them, right? So I want to be cautious of the idea of one person has the best practice, we should just replicate it. In fact, a lot of what we do is the exact opposite. A vision of community self-determination is somewhat the opposite, which is frustrating because we want the right answer and we want to copy and paste it. And I think part of what I'm trying to present is an alternative vision of like community self-determination is messy. Democracy is messy, but it gives us the space to create outcomes we otherwise wouldn't have the space to pursue, right? Let me just take one more question and then I'll, give you back your
Real
time.
quick, I think you already answered. Now, my thought on trying to achieve these community control is through forcing our legislators to make that. I mean, is there other ways supporting groups like yours or other groups? You know,
Well, I mean, obviously, we would love support if you, because we're not a nonprofit. Made a very intentional decision not to be a nonprofit to allow us to have a direct ability to advocate on people's behalf. So we have people that give us small amounts of money every month to keep our organization going. We also do like fee for service contracts and things like that. But
maybe my question is.
no, I know community control. I got you.
Yeah, what can the community do to say, hey, give us that money, other
Yeah.
than force their legislature to do that, other than.
This
That's
is something
about it.
I've had to learn over time. It's very difficult to legislate community control. What you can do is you can create a political framework and a legislative framework that gives the community the most opportunity to manifest its advocacy. So one of the biggest things that I did as director of research was learn from other states what they did with its cannabis money. Many people just like gave it to cops and did horrible stuff, but some people tried to do good stuff that didn't go right. So Illinois, big state with a big cannabis tax, but they have it all in the state capital with this traditional grant program that's very hard to access. Very few nonprofits qualify. So it basically just feeds the nonprofit industrial complex. It was hard for the people impacted by the war on drugs to get that money. So what we said was like, we're going to give it to localities, not because we trust the city council inherently more than the state delegates, but because most people have more leverage over their county council than they do with a state senator, a governor, or even a delegate. And the idea was, again, if you have it go to localities, then locality has to pass an ordinance. So there can't just be a slush fund for the county executive or the city mayor. So by having it have an ordinance that had to be passed through the county council, that gave the county council and city council, and therefore the people that voted for them, the ability to influence the legislation. So we did that knowing full well, like we've actually produced a document, a toolkit for people that wanted to use a reparations commission model. And many people actually they essentially copy elements of our reparations commission in Baltimore, knowing full well that we can't control that, nor should we. But if you structure the commission well, you'll have people who represent communities impacted by cannabis prohibition, and they can determine for themselves what they want the money to go to. So people would say what the money is going to go to, and I would say, if I told you that, it wouldn't be reparations. Because the reparations is not just giving people money, it's giving the people who are harmed the ability to choose the mechanism by which they achieve redress. And again, that's messy, that's unpredictable. But we believe ultimately, one of the biggest things I think people are begging for is more genuine small D democracy. And that's going to take time. That might be slightly less efficient, but that's going to create investment in the political process and the outcome that you won't get out other ways, right? So yeah, I would just say, look at your reparations commission, see if that's a place that you can have influence. And if not, figure out what you can do in the spaces that you have to create more opportunity for community power to have a real impact, right?
You said that was a bill last year that created these commissions?
Yeah, well, the state bill obviously passed a few years ago for
Okay.
cannabis legalization. But
Okay.
every county in Baltimore City had to pass an ordinance
Okay.
saying what it wanted to do with its money.
Okay.
Many counties did some version of the commission that we did in Baltimore City.
Okay.
I know y'all saying passed in 2024, but I don't see that it's been staffed yet.
So by reparations, you mean specifically for the war on drugs?
So yeah, so
Okay.
Howard County is going to get a proportion of the 35% of all cannabis tax revenue
Okay.
based upon its percentage, Howard County's percentage of cannabis arrests during a specific period of time, right?
Okay.
So it's going to be lower than Baltimore City's because Baltimore City had a ton of arrests, right?
Yeah.
But you're still going to have that money in a pot that you can choose what to do to
Okay.
invest in what the community believes is reparative of the harm of the money.
Good to know. Well, this is the last thing I said earlier. I had some questions. I had 3 questions. I'm gonna say all 3 and you can choose one to answer if that's okay. So
Okay.
the 3 were, one was, the YouTube video that I saw that, led me to, want to, ask you to do this presentation. It's called Hardcore Black History Part 2, Sloshing Towards Baltimore in Search of Black Power. So I want to ask, why to you is Jim Rouse, not just a significant figure in US history, but specifically in Black history, for better or worse?
Mhm.
That was one of the questions. The other one was, at the beginning of that YouTube video, you compared Jim Rouse to one historical figure, and that was Bill Clinton,
Mhm.
and that was not in a positive way. And you essentially said Jim Rouse was a major foundational figure to American neoliberalism, basically only comparable to the Clintons. And so want to ask you what makes you say that, and so why is he significant to Black history?
Mhm.
Why is he so significant to neoliberalism comparable to the Clintons? And the third one is you talked a lot about the nonprofit industrial complex. That's what we're going to be doing our event next month on. You're welcome to come back for that. But you know, so if you could talk a little bit about how the nonprofit industrial complex in practice entrenches special and private interests at the expense of actual social needs in communities that those same nonprofits say they're supposed to represent. And to the extent that you acknowledge that's how the nonprofit industrial complex works, was that by design or was that an
Yeah.
unintended consequence? So
Yes, so I'll answer the last one, but I'll try to tie in some other stuff. Like, yeah, I was stunned when I saw that McKissick reached out to Rouse,
Mackenzie Scott.
Floyd McKissick, who did Soul City,
Oh,
and that's a great book on Soul City that you all should read. Rouse was given the Presidential Medal of Freedom by Clinton, right? So I think that the vision of the market as being able to produce better people, like more virtuous people, bringing people together. And again, I think that we mythologize that through things like seeing investment in people, seeing investment in programs. Again, like, you know, they say with Nehemiah, Rouse wanted to invest in everything, but his vision of what should be invested in was reflected in his vision of the type of people that should be grown in the garden, right?
Yeah.
And that didn't reflect necessarily what the community wanted to be grown, right?
Yeah.
So I think that, again, I would just really lean on the fact that there's one of the biggest things to remember is that if you believe that oppressed people are human beings, you always have to question what is the opportunity cost? What is the trade-off with what we do? So the vision of the nonprofit industrial complex that we have, there is another world where the people, and it's not just that they're closest to the problem, there's no magic in personal experience, but people have culture, people have systems, people have resources and strategies that have kept them alive and thriving in the midst of intense suffering. If we actually invested in those systems, we could see transformative results, but we choose not to, right? So I think that's my biggest critique of the nonprofit industrial complex is the inability to see the people who are impacted by oppression, not just as victims, but as people having a culture and assets to be invested in to achieve concrete material results. Like, and this last thing, we're actually seeing record declines in violence in Baltimore, declines in shootings. And we're actually gonna have a podcast out next month saying that the real reason is the investments in community-based grassroots violence prevention. People that are using African-centered spirituality, people that are using the culture and resources of African people to reach people in ways that traditional nonprofits can't. And it's not some woo-woo, it's not just the right thing to do. It's materially, objectively more effective at stopping those shootings. And those are the sort of investments that get framed out and washed away when you lean on the nonprofit industrial, right? And lean on the vision that you need someone to come in and save you to achieve the result, right? So I think it's important to see the investment in community self-determination as an investment of the community's capacity to be its own solution to its own problems, right? And I think that's really what we want to push in the conversation.
Well, thank you. That was great.
I appreciate you all.
Presentation.
One
Yeah.
last thing before we go, if everyone will be so patient enough, maybe like another 3 minutes. Specifically, this is for everyone, but specifically this is for my colleagues at Howard County Perfect Palestine. We are going to organize a march, hopefully, within the next month. This is in response to Trump's plan to quote unquote buy and own Gaza. My personal goal for this is to not only involve Maryland Palestine and the Palestinian youth movement, but I strongly suggest that we incorporate outside resources that are from other states, such as within our lifetime. I know I suggest that a lot. The Freedom Dabke group that helps amplify sound. Sanadun, which is a Palestinian prisoner solidarity network, which keeps track of the conditions of Palestinians who have been falsely imprisoned, incarcerated, mixed in with youth and old. I suggest that we highly incorporate each of these organizations in, in comparison to what I've seen with arrest Netanyahu at the White House recently, not the first one. But it's time that this is a very controversial, like I said, a very controversial, a very upfront statement that even the Arab leaders that have sided with the Zionists have rejected. So it only means that we have to amplify, we have to intensify, and we need to show up, we need to continue spreading awareness, we need to use our numbers, because people look down on Howard County and Maryland as a whole as this very small state that has very, very categorized people, unfortunately, as far as what I've heard. So I think it's just very important that we prove them wrong for once. Everyone from this sector, whether you're from our revolution, Howard County, the LBS movement, or our own, I think it's important that we show up regardless. And I'm pleased to announce that I will be starting an SJP, Students for Justice in Palestine, at my community college. We are going to be incorporating them as well, hopefully, if we are able to develop ourselves within the time zone of the March as well.
Yeah.
So
Well, thank you,
Yes.
Iman, and thank you, everybody, for coming tonight. Thank you, Lawrence. Great job. Thank you all on virtually, and have a good night, everybody.